Is there a limit to how much we can understand about life, the universe, or even God? What happens when someone crosses that line? Friedrich Nietzsche was a man who pushed those boundaries to the limit. Many called him a genius, others called him crazy. But perhaps he was just someone who saw further than we were all prepared to see. In January 1889, on a street in Turin, Italy, Nietzsche witnessed a horse being violently whipped by its owner. Suddenly, overcome with deep emotion, he hugged the cow animal and cried. At that moment, something in him broke forever. This man, who had spent his entire life questioning everything, facing the abyss of the most difficult truths, had finally reached his limit. Nietzsche didn't just try to understand the world, he tried to change it through the incendiary power of his words. He questioned God, challenged traditional morality, advocated a new way of thinking, and paid the price with his own sanity. In this video, we'll explore the journey of the philosopher who saw beyond ordinary reality, the man who dared to face uncomfortable truths. You'll not only understand Nietzsche, you'll also discover what his story can reveal about yourself. Before we embark on this journey, make sure you are subscribed to the channel so you don't miss out on in-depth transformative content like this. The Young Genius, The Making of Solitary. To understand how Nietzsche arrived at that silent embrace on the horse, we need to go back to the beginning, to the childhood of a frail, sensitive, and precocious boy who from an early age experienced the weight of loss and the bitter taste of loneliness. Friedrich was born in 1844 in the small town of Recurrence, Germany. His father, a respected Lutheran pastor, died when Nietzsche was only 5 years old. Not long after, his younger brother also passed away. These losses had a profound effect on his worldview. It was as if, at a very young age, he had been introduced to the fragility of existence. Growing up, in a household dominated by women, his mother, grandmother, and aunts, Nietzsche developed an introspective outlook and an unusual maturity. He was no ordinary child. He read voraciously, had intense reflections, and delved into topics that seemed too big for his age. At age 14, he was accepted into an elite school, and at age 24, he became the youngest professor in the history of the University of Basel. But along with his brilliant intellect came constant physical pain, migraines, vision, ear problems, digestive disorders, and gradually academic life began to seem too narrow for someone who yearned to break through all the confines of traditional thought. Nietzsche was not a loud rebel. His rebellion was quiet, made up of sharp words and subversive ideas. He felt out of place even among intellectuals. It was as if his mind was on another frequency, deep, lonely, and increasingly distant from the world around him. The construction of the solitary was not an accident. It was the result of someone who, from a very young age, learned to look within, instead of seeking ready-made answers from the outside. And the deeper he dived, the harder it was to return to the surface. If you're enjoying this dive into Nietzsche's mind, please leave a like now. This helps the video reach more people and motivates us to continue producing in-depth content like this. The puzzle of reality, philosophy as combat. Nietzsche did not see philosophy as an academic exercise. For him, thinking was an act of combat, a clash against everything that was false, inherited, imposed. His writing was not meant to please, but to awaken. It was a hammer blow to the dormant conscience of a civilization that he believed was living under illusions. His philosophy began to take shape from the conviction that the modern world had lost its spiritual axis. The great statement that would immortalize him in the philosophical imagination came in a short but devastating sentence: God is dead. Nietzsche was not celebrating the death of God. He was warning of its consequences. Western civilization had built its morals, values, and sense of meaning on the idea of an absolute God, the source of good and order. When he realized that this God had become, for many, irrelevant or symbolic, Nietzsche saw the imminent collapse of the structure that had sustained society. Without God, what was left? A void, a growing nihilism in which nothing seemed to make sense anymore. But Nietzsche was not content with the diagnosis. He proposed a reconstruction. In place of traditional morality, which for him valued submission, sacrifice, and the denial of life, a new type of human being should emerge, one who affirms existence with total force, who does not need absolutes to live intensely. It is at this point that he introduces the concept of will to power, the vital force that drives every being to overcome itself, to grow, to create. Unlike the survival instinct, this will does not just want to exist. It wants to affirm its existence, dominate chaos, and transform suffering into creative power. Another of his most enigmatic concepts is that of eternal return. Imagine that your life, with all its moments, good, bad, repetitive, painful, were relived infinitely, with no possibility of change. Would you live it the same way? This idea is not a metaphysical prediction, but an ethical provocation. Nietzsche challenges the viewer to live in such an intense and true way that if he had to repeat everything eternally, he would not regret a thing. These ideas were not well received, they were too radical, too dangerous. But Nietzsche was not seeking approval. His commitment was to the truth, even if it hurt. And the truth he saw was this: most people live in flight from reality. They prefer comfort to lucidity, obedience to autonomy. And he then armed himself with words to fight against this collective numbness. Philosophy was his sword, and the world his battlefield. Against the world, misunderstood, rejected, isolated. As his ideas became more and more acute, Nietzsche found himself increasingly distant from others, not only in the content of what he said, but in the way he said it. His texts were enigmatic, poetic, often explosive. He did not write to explain, he wrote to shake, and that is why almost no one understood him. Academia, once his safe haven, became a hostile environment. His peers considered him eccentric, arrogant, even incoherent. The university saw him as a provocateur, not a serious philosopher. But perhaps the problem was never him. Perhaps Nietzsche was simply years ahead of his time, and that to most sounds like madness. His personal relationships also began to deteriorate. His friendship with the composer Richard Wagner, initially intense and admiring, deteriorated as Nietzsche became aware of the nationalist and Christian excesses in his friend's work. In the Wagner affair, he broke off the relationship once and for all, harshly, criticizing the man he had once idolized. Nietzsche pushed people away and was pushed away. His sister, Elizabeth, with whom he had a strong bond in his youth, ended up becoming a manipulative figure in his life. After the philosopher's death, she distorted many of his works to serve ideologies that were opposed to what he believed in, including Nazism. Ironically, the man who most fought against the herd, obedience, and religious fanaticism had his words hijacked by precisely these forces. Meanwhile, he wrote, isolated in the Swiss Alps or in the Italian cities he passed through, Nietzsche produced his most dense and visionary works. Thus spoke Zarathustra, beyond good and evil, the genealogy of morals. Very few people read them, and those who did almost always rejected them. Nietzsche did not seek approval, but the total lack of recognition began to take its toll. His physical health deteriorated, his seizures increased, and the feeling of speaking to a void intensified. He was not just shouting against God or morality. He was shouting against the silence of the world, a silence that hurts more than any criticism. At this point in history, we might ask ourselves, did the world ignore Nietzsche because it was not ready? Or did it choose to ignore him because listening to him meant facing too many truths? And you, honestly, what do you think about this? Leave a comment. Was Nietzsche a madman or a visionary that no one wanted to listen to? The Fall, the mind in ruins. Nietzsche resisted for a long time. He resisted loneliness, constant physical pain, the scorn of critics, the silence of readers. He resisted as long as he could. But there comes a time when even the strongest of men bend, not out of weakness, but out of an excess of lucidity. His last years before his collapse were marked by an almost superhuman intensity. He wrote with fury, as if time were running out. Works such as Twilight of the Idols and the Antichrist are ferocious attacks on everything that is considered sacred in the West. Religion, morality, politics, even the notion of absolute truth. Nietzsche seemed to be trying to exercise the world with words, but these words were becoming increasingly disjointed, symbolic, and delirious. Some of the letters he wrote during this period, now known as the Letters from Madness, are addressed to figures such as God, Caesar, Jesus, and Dionysus. He signed himself as the Crucified, or Dionysus, as if his identity were dissolving amid the myths and symbols he had studied so deeply. In January 1889, At the age of 44, Nietzsche collapsed on the streets of Turin. Seeing a horse being whipped, he ran to the animal, threw his arms around it, and burst into tears. He was rescued by acquaintances, and from that moment on he never returned to a state of full consciousness. His mind, the one that had dared to pierce the thickest veils of existence, was shattered. There were many diagnoses: tertiary syphilis, bipolar, disorder, schizophrenia, even possible drug poisoning. The truth is that no one knows for sure what happened, but perhaps the cause is not medical. Perhaps what destroyed Nietzsche was what he sought most: the raw, unvarnished truth. Imagine living in a world where no one understands you, where your every word is ignored, ridiculed, or distorted. Imagine questioning everything, and in the end, finding nothing solid to stand on. No beliefs, no morals, no meaning, just the abyss. Nietzsche did not fall all at once. He slipped slowly as his ideas became too big to carry alone. What many considered madness may have been just the exhaustion of someone who had thought more than the world could bear. After his collapse, he was placed in the care of his mother and then his sister. He spent the last 11 years of his life without writing a single line, sunk in a state of mental alienation. A sad silence for someone whose entire life was made up of words. But this silence also speaks. It reminds us that the human mind has limits, that questioning everything has a price, that perhaps there is something dangerous in extreme lucidity. Nietzsche unintentionally became the living example of what he said. Whoever fights with monsters should be careful not to become one of them. And when you gaze long into the abyss also gazes into you. He looked deep, and the abyss answered. The wisdom of madness, what Nietzsche left us. Nietzsche died in 1900, but his influence would only begin to grow in the following decades. As the 20th century exploded into wars, revolutions, and crises of meaning, his words, previously ignored, began to be seen in a new light. It was as if he had foreseen it all: the collapse of certainties, the rise of nihilism, humanity's loss of direction. Today, it is almost impossible to study philosophy, psychology, literature, or art without coming across his ideas. Even though he did not want to be a master, he became one. He inspired names such as Freud, Jung, Foucault, Camus, Sartre, and profoundly influenced the way we see the modern human being, divided, in crisis, but free to create his own path. Nietzsche didn't want followers. He wanted individuals who could think for themselves. That's why his work doesn't offer easy answers. It dismantles certainties, breaks patterns, and forces us to face uncomfortable questions. The will to power, for example, is not a selfish or violent ambition. It is the creative impulse that transforms suffering into art, pain into overcoming, life into affirmation. For Nietzsche, living intensely is affirming everything we are, including that which hurts us, limits us, and challenges us. The eternal return, far from being a superstition, is an ethical test. Are you living a life that would be worth repeating infinitely? This seemingly absurd question forces us to think radically about each choice, each habit, each day lived on autopilot. His figure of the overman, often translated as Superman, is not a superior being who dominates others, but someone who transcends inherited values and creates his own morality, his own life, free from the herd, yet authentically connected to existence. Nietzsche left us not a philosophy of consolation, but a philosophy of courage. He did not want to alleviate the pain of existence. He wanted to teach us to dance with it, and that is why, even though he ended his life in silence and suffering, he lives on in the restless minds that are not satisfied with ready-made answers. His madness was, perhaps, the price for seeing the world without filters. But within this madness, there is a brutal, raw, and deeply human wisdom. Nietzsche left us no answers. He left mirrors, and us, the invitation to courage. After learning about Nietzsche's trajectory, his ideas, his solitude, his downfall, it's hard not to ask, what about us? Where are we in this story? We live in a time when questioning is uncomfortable. It's easier to go with the flow, to repeat speeches, to fit into ready-made roles. But Nietzsche shows us that there is a price to not thinking, and an even greater cost to thinking too much. The truth is that many of us live under anesthesia. We wake up, work, get distracted, sleep, and repeat. Not because of a lack of ability, but because of fear. Fear of emptiness, fear of change, fear of discovering that a large part of our lives were built on values that we never really chose. Nietzsche is an uncomfortable mirror because he asks us all the time, do you have the courage to live as if every choice were eternal? Could you bear to be who you are infinitely? It's not about seeking suffering or becoming a radical loner. It's about stopping running away, taking responsibility for yourself, not transferring the burden of your life to God, to society, to your parents, to fate. Being free is not comfortable. Being authentic is not easy, but it is the only way to exist fully. Nietzsche calls us to a silent rebellion, not against the external world, but against inner cowardice, against the little habits that keep us blind, passive, controlled. And if you've come this far, it's because some part of you is ready for this calling, to face yourself without masks, to ask the hard questions, to, who knows, create a life worth repeating. If this reflection has provoked you in any way, if it has made you think differently, leave your like now. It may seem like a simple gesture, but it is what helps us to continue spreading ideas that disturb, awaken, and liberate. The last truth, Nietzsche ended his life in silence, immersed in an inner darkness from which he never returned. But paradoxically, this silence echoes to this day. His words, rejected in life, spread like seeds sown in time, and germinated in restless minds like his own. He didn't want disciples. He wanted people to be awakened. He didn't want to be worshipped, but to be understood, and most importantly, to be questioned. Because Nietzsche knew that every truth that cannot be questioned is a lie disguised as virtue. And perhaps this is the last truth he tried to leave us. The courage to think for yourself is one of the purest forms of freedom. Nietzsche crossed the abyss, and even though he lost his way, he left trails so that others can follow their own journey. Not to imitate him, but to dare to be different, to dare to be true, to dare to be whole. If this video made you think, if it made you restless, great. That was exactly the purpose. Because sometimes the greatest revolution happens in silence, inside the mind of those who finally choose to live with their eyes open. And if you want to continue diving into ideas that provoke, disturb, and transform, subscribe to the channel now. Here the search for truth never stops, even when it scares us.